Hello YouTube, and welcome to my very first video of 2019. I got completely lost in my holiday and crippling game addiction also did not help in the video making process. But do not work, game hath been finished, and so it's time for more Elder Scrolls lore. Today we start 2019 off good by continuing a much requested series, the series of the current situations. How are the other provinces faring by the time of Skyrim? I already covered Morrowind, High Rock, Hammerfell, Elsewhere and Valenwood, and now it's time for the Summerset Isles. So with that said, let's immediately kick off with the video. So, the Summerset Isles. We talked about them a lot in former videos, but it's time to bring some of the current info on them together. And we are going to talk about how the islands are faring now. Now, I must warn you up front that if you watched a lot of my videos, you're gonna hear a lot of the same information. I have added some of my own speculation that we haven't talked about before in this, but this is mainly just a video bringing past information together. So, if you have watched all my videos, I'm sorry if it's not that interesting to you, but let's do it anyway. So, as most of us know by now, the Summerset Isles are the center of power of the Altmerry Dominion, the nation which is governed by the Thalmor party. If you wish to know more about their rise during the early 4th era, I would suggest watching my video on the Thalmor for more information. But in short, their rise as an authoritarian party that would come to rule the Summerset Isles was hallmarked by a much political violence in the early days of the regime and increasing blackmail of political opponents later on. The Thalmor made the Summerset Isles into a totalitarian state, where the political enemies, mostly High Elves who favored the Empire, would be prosecuted as traitors or killed under shadowy circumstances. This did not only go for High Elves that supported the Empire, also just in general other races that they saw as inferior. Now, the general High Elf audience in the Summerset Isles, after a lot of years under Imperial rule and the chaos following the Oblivion Crisis and the subsequent death of High Chancellor Orcato, which basically, well, it completely destroyed all hope that the Empire would be quickly restored. All this largely made them welcome the more nationalistic and anti-imperial rule of the Thalmor for the Summerset Isles. And over the years the Thalmor started an effective propaganda campaign tapping into anti-imperial resentment within the High Elf race, and then becoming more isolated as a country. Eventually they renamed their country Eleanor and cut most ties with the Empire. Now, after some time, as we have talked about a couple of times before now, they would soon form the Altmerry Dominion with Valenwood after staging an anti-imperial coup there. And after a few decades, Elsewhere was added to the bunch as client states of the Dominion. Not direct members, but client states, the two kingdoms of Elsewhere. Now, as we know, 30 years ago the Altmerry Dominion under the Thalmor initiated an attack against the Cyrodiilic Empire that started a 5-year war now known as the Great War. The Thalmor were a year into the war, very certain that they would be able to topple the Empire and gain complete political dominance on Tamriel. However, this is not exactly what happened, as the Empire with the last bit of its strength managed to wipe out nearly the entire invading force of the Thalmor in the Battle of the Red Ring. This is all history. But what happened after then in the Summerset Isles? Well, we don't know an awful lot, but based on the dialogue and other sources that we have, we can make some educated guesses on what happened in the Summerset Isles after the Great War, although we don't have much to go on, I must admit that. We can assume that after all the superiority propaganda of the Thalmor in the years prior to the Great War, and the expected negative propaganda on the Empire within the Summerset Isles, which they would have used to justify a war against the Empire, that all this worked pretty well for them, and that the image of the Empire would not be very great in the Summerset Isles if they did their job correctly with a propaganda war. And basically nobody would really be, well, against a war with the Empire if you've been fed propaganda after such a long time that they are the worst thing to ever exist. And remember, political enemies were already gone. I mean, most Imperial supporters were just killed or they were exiled or whatever. The Thalmor before the war were pretty much seen as the saviors of the Summerset Isles by those that remained in the Summerset Isles, as most political enemies, as I said before, were killed, jailed or fled abroad. I have to give this my personal guess. Because the Thalmor would probably have launched a very effective propaganda campaign in the Summerset Isles, calling for the people to join up with the military and even handpicking commanders among skilled individuals. We know that they did that. According to the Falkreath priest Runil, who was once a high elf commander in the Dominion armed forces, it was a great honor for an individual to be selected by the Thalmor themselves. Meaning that the propaganda worked like a charm, because if you were selected by the Thalmor, that was a great honor, so clearly they did their work well. This meant that the people of the Summerset Isles that joined up for the army would probably believe that there was a glorious pushover victory to be achieved, which probably led to the great enthusiasm for war among Thalmor loyalists. Now, the Thalmor would have had a relatively easy way to deliver that message to the population for like the first 4 years of the war. The war was going very well for them, and propaganda at home would already have depicted a glorious victory, and that it was already largely achieved, because after, I believe, 2 years into the war, they already believed that, well, the Empire was standing on its last legs. Yet it held out for another 3 years and eventually destroyed their army. Now, unfortunately for them, Red Ring happened. And for that you should really watch my Great War video, but they basically annihilated the entire invading army, killing thousands of elves. And I wouldn't think that a sudden defeat like that, with thousands of elves being killed and almost your entire invading army being killed, is easily justified back home in the Summerset Isles, where you've been basically blasting propaganda that everything is probably going well. Again, this is not canon that this happened, but that's very likely, according to the things that we know that happened prior and if we know the Thalmor strategies. Afraid for more losses, and the Empire maybe having more tricks like Red Ring up its sleeve, the Dominion quickly makes peace with the Empire with the White Gold Concordat, which makes it seem like a victory. But so many deaths and a quick hasty end to a war that at home was probably portrayed as a walk in the park, must have turned some heads in the Dominion, like, are we really on the right course? This leads me to personally believe that the Thalmor support back home directly after the Great War is probably not as tight as they lead us to believe, meaning that Summerset by the day of Skyrim, or at least in the years after the Great War, the few years, either faced political instability or, more likely, more purges of political enemies in an attempt of the Thalmor to stay in absolute control. That second option seems to be the more likely one. But all this is basically to illustrate the fact that most likely in the Summerset Isles there are no opponents of the Thalmor left, or they are doing it in very secret, because they have been very effective at eliminating political opponents. So their rule is basically unchallenged in the Summerset Isles. As I said, I personally think that the current inhabitants of the Summerset Isles most likely still support the Thalmor pretty well, and that the enemies that they made after the Great War again fled abroad, like we see in Runil and Nerenyi, who both fled the Summerset Isles after the war. We also know that the Thalmor have created a situation even after the losses of the war where the Summerset Isles are still pretty doing alright in terms of quality of life. My personal guess is that to keep public support on their side after the war, they diverted much of the crisis by basically making sure that the life for the people that were in Summerset, that it was great, so they wouldn't lose the base of their power. They probably did this by exploiting Valenwood and elsewhere in terms of resources to basically keep the people of Summerset happy, but we don't have any proof for that. But that's something that I would personally do if I were to run such an empire and my whole... Basically, I felt my power base crumbling below me. That's something I would do, but then again, it's my personal guess, so this is interesting to think about, but it's not canon. We know that by the time of Skyrim that the Thalmor have a pretty strong hand in trade all over Tamriel, meaning that my suspicions that at least Summerset is doing pretty well are more or less confirmed. Now, we cannot say much else about what's currently happening in Summerset. We can't really say how daily life looks like, or any of those kind of things, because we don't have any information. As I said, most political enemies have been rooted out in the Summerset Isles, so it's probably pretty peaceful and normal for those that remain, as there is no one to challenge Thalmor rule, and thus, you know, there isn't much unrest, I would think, at least by the time of Skyrim, 30 years after the war. Maybe after the war, just in a few years, as I said before, there was maybe some unrest, but probably the Thalmor rooted it out pretty quickly. In terms of events, what happened in the Summerset Isles after the Great War, as I said, it's mostly one black hole. The Thalmor are not too keen on sharing information on what's happening at home, so it's basically all guesswork, and if anything big happened, well, we just don't know anything about it, unfortunately. But with that said, we've reached the end of this video. I've basically said everything that I know about what's currently going on in the Summerset Isles, and it's very little, but I hope that with the little bit of background information that I gave you, that it maybe give you a more clearer picture. I hope so, at least. Anyway, this was a very requested video over the last few months, I think. Since the last time I did a current situation of a province video is quite a few months ago, so yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I think the last one we have to tackle is Black Marsh, and of course there is Cyrodiil, but Cyrodiil we also said a lot about in other videos. So yeah, I don't know when those are gonna come, but Black Marsh is certainly interesting. But I feel like I covered a lot of it in my NC Heal video, so watch that if you can't wait for such a video to appear. With that said, if you like this video, like, subscribe, do those kind of things. If you want personal contact with me, my Discord and Instagram are in the description. If you want to support me in a more personal way, there is my Patreon. If you support me with $1 or more, you get all the benefits. So, you know, check it out if you want to see. And with that said, I will see you all in my next lore video, probably in a few days. I'll see you all later. Bye bye.